Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Nick, and this is the continuation to the last video where we will be talking about voting rights in the United States. Last video, we focused mainly on the foundation, so early colonies into early America, leading into about the early 20th century and the creation of Jim Crow laws, ones that restricted the right to vote and the right to really live and thrive for Black Americans. So this week we are continuing and trying to give still a incomplete but general history to voting rights in the United States. Today I thought I would kind of continue by looking at the 19th Amendment. The 19th Amendment that passed in 1920 was meant to make it so that gender did not have a role in someone's right to vote. So it allowed for women the right to vote, but part of the problem was that the Jim Crow laws discussed in the previous video were restricting the right for basically all BIPOC people. For those who forgot, BIPOC stands for Black, Indigenous, People of Color. So as a result, it made it so that until the Voting Rights Act of 1965, Black Americans and anyone else who was a person of color was limited in their ability to vote by a lot of different laws that were put in place. So the 19th Amendment, that is often cherished as this grand new policy, new addition to the Constitution, didn't actually work for anyone who wasn't white. By the time that we got to the Civil Rights Movement, two pieces of legislation really led to greater rights for Black Americans and BIPOC people. This would be the 24th Amendment, passed in 1964, which ended poll taxes. So again, poll taxes are those that are put onto people who they must pay in order to vote, and the Constitution now says that is not allowed. It is a restriction to voting. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 passed shortly after and made it so that states in the South who were actually known for racism when it came to voting, with things like poll taxes and Jim Crow laws, had to report to the Justice Department to acknowledge that they were not committing acts of racism when they were creating policy for voting. So that means that in the South, there were meant to be restrictions to ensure that Black people had the right to vote. So in the modern age, that has actually changed. There was a court case a few years ago that made it so that the South did not have to ensure the right to vote, or rather that they didn't have to check with the Justice Department and could make whatever laws they wanted. The court case argued that the South had done enough to prove that they had been good. Of course, we are seeing now that that's not really what's happening. There are new laws, and in fact old laws, that continue under different names that try to ensure that BIPOC individuals cannot vote as effectively, or really just at all. Poll taxes aren't as specifically poll taxes. There are limits like ensuring that people have to have an ID in order to vote. In order to get an ID, in many cases you do have to pay. So for a driver's license, you have to pay for it. So that is a barrier that people argue should not be there, and is in essence a poll tax. For those who are convicted felons, they are in some states unable to vote after they have served their time. And in many cases, especially because of the war on drugs in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s today, many of the people who are in jail as a result of felonies are Black and brown individuals who, as a result, have lost the right to vote. Another way that in the modern era, states and local governments are trying to make it harder for Black individuals to vote is by creating name matching laws. The basic idea is that if you show up at the polling place and your name on your ID does not perfectly match what you're registered as for voting, then they can say you're not allowed to vote. This does affect Black and brown communities. For those who have names that are not within the white norm or the status quo, names that have dashes and apostrophes that may have been missed when someone was typing it in and therefore is perceived as inaccurate or as if they're going to commit voter fraud. Voter fraud is actually the justification for a lot of the arguments behind why certain states have these voter ID laws or these name matching laws. So, of course, as a result, it does affect Black and brown individuals and BIPOC people in general. So, as we look to the 2020 election, we will start to consider what can we as individuals do to make sure that these laws that have been created are either not as effectively enforced so that everyone has equal access to voting, or, of course, how can we, those who are either light-skinned or white passing or just white, how can we use that privilege to make it so that we vote in the spaces we know we can, so that the people we elect can change these laws, or just making our voice heard to ensure that in the spaces we know this is happening, that they can't happen. We have to be willing to call attention to things that may make others uncomfortable, but that's part of our role, is to speak up and make noise so that we can make change. That is essentially it for this video. There is, of course, a lot of other laws and ideas that were put into place to ensure that BIPOC individuals could not vote that I didn't even cover. But I think this does paint a clear story that there are problematic laws that exist today and ones that have only changed because people spoke to their issues and spoke to the reality of the problem, and acknowledged the racism that existed in those laws. But we're not done yet. We have to keep going. As a reminder, make sure that you check out Fair Fight, the organization created by Stacey Abrams, in order to support the fight against voter suppression. And of course, register to vote on vote.org if you have not already, or get someone else registered to vote and let them know what they need to do to combat voter suppression in the United States. Thank you very much, and look out for next week's video where we'll continue to talk on issues of voting rights.